For the first time in recent history, India is seeing economic refugees coming into the country from neighboring Sri Lanka. Also, in the past, political turmoil caused refugees from Sri Lanka and earlier from the then East Pakistan to stream into India. So it's always been politics that has been the cause of refugees who came into India. But it seems that things have changed. So you, for the first time, have economic refugees, though they are small in number at the moment, but still, they have broken, let's say, or cut through the ceiling, and it's unprecedented in that sense. On Tuesday, that is 16 refugees from northern Sri Lanka made their way into Tamil Nadu. And the reason was that they were completely desperate to get hold of basic rations. People who are wondering why they couldn't get the basic rations back in Sri Lanka, the reason is pretty straightforward. For the last few months, Sri Lanka is reeling from an unprecedented economic crisis. Fuel is in severe shortage, essential commodities are scarce, and in some places, people are fighting with each other to get hold of day-to-day stuff. Reports even say that troops are guarding even petrol bunks, reflecting the intensity of the crisis. Earlier this week, exams were cancelled across the country as there was a severe shortage of paper, and the government did not have the funds to procure it. A country heavily dependent on imports, Sri Lanka has no foreign exchange to fund essential goods, all of which have to come from other countries. How did Sri Lanka get into this disastrous situation? To discuss this, we have with us Sri Lankan academic, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Jaffna University in Jaffna. Dr. Kadirgamar writes extensively in various media within Sri Lanka and elsewhere. He is currently the honorary chair of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank and a member of the Jaffna People's Forum for Coexistence. Welcome, Dr. Kadirgamar. Sri Lanka has suddenly become very important for, may I say, for the wrong reasons. What has driven Sri Lanka to the edge?
In a sense, this crisis has been long in the making. Sri Lanka's economy has always been a dependent one, and all the more so over the last 4 decades with liberalization. But it's in the last 10 years after the war, Sri Lanka has also been aggressively borrowing in the international capital markets. So one aspect of the current crisis is a sovereign debt crisis. So floating sovereign bonds, which have been maturing every 6 months or so, and Sri Lanka lacks the foreign exchange to be able to repay those loans. The other aspect to this crisis is that for a long time now, we have a large trade deficit. And we were able to rectify that trade deficit through tourism earnings, as well as foreign remittances. Now, the COVID pandemic and the disruptions brought about by that completely disrupted our tourism sector and even reduced our foreign remittances from those going and working overseas. And in that context, our credit ratings have been falling, and we've not been able to roll over previous debt. Now, all of this has compounded into a crisis that has definitely been making over the last 2 years. And we must say it has been very poorly managed by our government. For example, as I mentioned, our imports have been about 80% higher than our exports. So by 2 years ago, when the COVID crisis hit, we should have drastically reduced our imports and focused on essential goods. But if you look at the data for 2021, last year, we had the peak amount of imports in our history, $21 billion US. So it does not make sense. Everybody knew we were in a very deep crisis. The government took very few measures to restrict those imports. So if we had restricted those imports, our foreign exchange wouldn't have dwindled down to a situation where we hardly have enough foreign exchange to import even for 1 month. So how did this situation arise? Partly, I would say the government does not have the political will to address this crisis. In the 1970s, for example, we had a very strong public distribution system, similar to perhaps the public distribution system you have in India, to be able to at least ensure that the essential goods, whether it's food, medicines, reach the public. Now, that is not there. When they allow private traders in a time when foreign exchange is low to import such items, they will go where the highest margin is. If it is luxury items that they can get a higher margin on, and that is what has been happening over the last 2 years. So the first thing is that the government needs to put in place a public distribution system and ensure that the imports reach the public. The second issue is that despite this huge crisis with COVID, and particularly the bottom section of our people, the working people have been very much affected. There should have been relief for the people. But if you compare the data in South Asia, Sri Lanka has provided the least amount of relief during the COVID disruption. And a reason for that is that soon after the election in 2019 of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, they drastically reduced our taxes, both the indirect taxes, the value-added tax, as well as income taxes, to an extent where we lost a third of our tax revenue. So there is both a balance of payment problem and also a fiscal crisis where the government is unable to provide relief. And once we are in this downward spiral of an economic crisis, it's very hard to increase taxes because everybody's incomes are falling. So the only option now would be to impose some kind of a wealth tax to be able to draw from the accumulated wealth and redistribute it. But again, it doesn't look like the government has the public will to do that. And in that context, they are mainly borrowing from international actors, including India, but there is no longer-term solution in sight.
I see. I'll just ask. We've been looking at some of the stories that are coming out from Sri Lanka, and according to one, milk powder is, for instance, 790 rupees for 400 grams. One loaf of bread costs 130 rupees. I'm talking of Sri Lankan rupees. Then you have 1 kg rice costing rupees 290. Now, how would a family of 4 manage their lives with such prices?
Well, then this is the huge problem for working people, because whether you take bread, milk powder, both have almost doubled in the last 6 to 9 months in price. Rice has gone up by anywhere from 50 to 75%, depending on the variety of rice. And rice is a staple. So in that kind of a context, there's already a huge amount of suffering. And the worry is that this is going to continue. Part of the reason for the price hikes is that the rupee has depreciated amidst this crisis by as much as 50%, from 200 rupees to a US dollar to now close to 300 rupees to a US dollar. But that's not the whole story. When there isn't enough supplies coming in, there's also hoarding by traders and increased prices, shortages of supply. So even milk powder, even if people have the money, sometimes they can't find it on the shelves of shops. So this kind of disruption can only be controlled by the state, but they are not putting in any mechanism to address that.
See, we are now looking at refugees who are coming from northern Sri Lanka, Jaffna, which is closer to India, of course. But as far as the economic crisis is concerned, if you take Colombo as the epicenter, obviously it's the capital of Sri Lanka, would it be right to kind of conclude that Jaffna is experiencing even more of an issue because it's that much more far removed from Colombo in terms of supplies and in terms of the prices, etc. Is it starker in Jaffna? I mean, why do we see that this kind of situation where refugees are coming from or people are coming in from Jaffna?
No, I think the crisis is affecting the entire country. in some ways, in urban areas, people are finding it even more difficult because there's also cooking gas is in shortage, various services and supplies. So in the rural areas, people are able to manage with some amount of subsistence, or they can use firewood for cooking and so on. So urban areas also hit badly. But I think the difference is that the North and East, because we went through a 2.5 decade long war, um, the people are much more vulnerable. The post-war development and reconstruction was in many ways a failure. So a vulnerable population, when there's another shock, they are much more likely to fall back into poverty. They don't have much of a safety net. So I think
Right.
that is a reason for concern that people in northern and eastern Sri Lanka might even suffer more. And I'm not sure that this refugee crisis would become a large crisis. It might also be that historically, during the war, people did travel to Tamil Nadu and there were strong connections with Tamil Nadu. So people have made that journey before. So that might be a reason, but hopefully it won't become a large wave of refugees. And my own sense is that it will not become such a crisis of that sort.
Okay. Coming back to the situation, you did talk about COVID as a reason, and also the fact that a lot of imports had happened without probably much of a thinking. But there was also an issue regarding the organic fertilizers or organic agricultural policy, which probably, do you think even that compounded, issues like that compounded the situation?
Definitely. So, while the COVID was a pandemic and a disaster beyond our control, the president made a very disastrous policy change last year in a sudden ban on imported fertilizers. This is after decades of introducing chemical fertilizers on which farmers had become dependent. And this has greatly reduced the yield in agriculture. So many agricultural economists believe that rice, which since the 1980s Sri Lanka is self-sufficient on, and it's our staple, that paddy yields during the last monsoon season might have fallen by 30 to 40%. So now we are in this difficult situation where we lack foreign exchange and we might have to import rice on top of that, whereas we were in effect self-sufficient, and it was this policy decision on the part of the president and his advisors that have created a major problem for agriculture. Because with the COVID-19 disruption and the disruption of the service sector, a lot of the people turned to agriculture, including to subsistence agriculture, because that's the way they saw, because they couldn't find jobs in urban areas. They couldn't go abroad for employment. But that move also was disrupted by this policy of banning fertilizers.
The Gotabaya Rajapaksa government came in with a heavy landslide victory in the previous elections. But with this kind of a situation, you think it's going to impact, what kind of impact, or rather, what kind of impact will it have on the government, on the Rajapaksa government?
Yeah, definitely this is going to have an impact. They are very quickly losing their legitimacy. And in a way, it's their own making, since they came to power soon after the pandemic hit us, but they were not thinking of policies to address the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. Instead, they passed the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which was to heap huge amounts of powers in the president, so political consolidation. They passed a controversial Colombo Port City Bill, which is the port city built on reclaimed land with Chinese investment. So those were their priorities, as opposed to providing relief to the people or addressing the problems that the food system was already showing stresses of. So the consequence has been now suddenly there are protests almost on a daily basis. The people are very angry, and Sri Lanka has a long history of democracy. We are the oldest country in Asia in terms of universal suffrage, going back to 1931. And we have consistently thrown out regimes, no matter how strong they are. So I think this will definitely have a political impact. On the other hand, this crisis is so serious that any new government that comes in is also going to have a very difficult time.
I see. Geopolitically speaking, in recent years, China has moved close to Sri Lanka. But in this current crisis, for some reason, for China has not been very forthcoming in attempting to help or even saying it's going to help. In fact, on the contrary, they've been seem to be very recalcitrant, and they're not actually going ahead with supporting Sri Lanka. What do you make of it? I mean, why is China hesitant? I mean, why are they not coming forward and doing something? Not because they have to. India is also there, but now the fact that they're moving closer to, yeah, geopolitically, for them, I don't know how they view this or how you see this, their resistance or their reluctance rather.
Yeah, Sri Lanka is at the center of a geopolitical, shall we say, struggle with India, China, and the United States, all trying to aim for some of our strategic assets as well to create a presence in the island. And in a way, Sri Lanka has a long relationship with all three countries. Sri Lanka's relationship with China also goes back to the 1950s, when we were in a previous rice crisis, when the rubber rice deal was made with China. So there's a long relationship with China. But over the last 12, 13 years after the war in particular, there's been increased amounts of Chinese investment. And on and off, China has been also providing financial support. In the a few months after the pandemic, there was much more support forthcoming from China, and including this Colombo port city that was being built. But Sri Lanka's problems are much more wide-ranging. People talk about the Chinese debt trap, but if you look at our external debt, the bulk of our external debt is not to China. China has about 10% of our external debt. Japan has about 10%. Then about 30% to multilateral institutions like the World Bank and ADB at concessionary rates. But the real problem is debt to these capital markets in the form of sovereign bonds, which forms about 40%. And the interest rates there are also 6.5 to 8.5% in US dollar terms. So it's very high interest rates, which is not sustainable. So Sri Lanka has had to draw support from various actors and is playing this difficult balancing game of wooing the West, of trying to gain support from India, as well as of China. So no single country seems to have the hold on Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is also desperate to work with all actors, which might also be a factor that most countries are also playing this game of, they will only provide support if you lean completely on them.
The crisis that Sri Lanka is in is not an ordinary crisis in the sense that it seems to have gone, quite deep into its economy and some of the historical reasons why this has happened. Now, to get out of this situation or to retrieve this situation, what do you think Sri Lanka should ideally do so that, even if it's not immediate over the next few years, get out in such a way that you don't get back into this kind of a problem?
Yeah, the solution being proposed by the government now after a long delay and proposed by the opposition, the main opposition, the SJB, and for that matter, a number of our think tanks, is to go for an IMF agreement and to be able to, with IMF assistance, restructure our debt. Now that has become a moot point. It seems clear that that's where Sri Lanka is headed. But my own view on this is that going to the IMF is not going to solve our problem. We are in a much deeper crisis. their idea that going to the IMF would increase our credit rating so that we can borrow more in the capital markets is also not going to solve the problem, because that's only going to increase our debt stock. We have gone for 16 IMF agreements in our history, and all that has happened is to delay the crisis. So in that kind of a context, I would say we really need to rethink the structure of our economy. Immediately, we have to provide relief to the people, the need for a public distribution system, some kind of redistribution with a wealth tax. But in the medium term, we have to increase local production with self-sufficiency in view, and continue with the exports by prioritizing intermediate goods and essential items. Going to the IMF can also bring about other problems, in the sense that the conditionalities that are expected from the IMF is to market price energy, to make it a completely flexible exchange rate, and to let the market mechanism work, along with austerity in terms of fiscal situation. Now, this is going to be very hard on the people, even more hard, I would say, because one of Sri Lanka's strengths historically is that we still have free healthcare and free education policies. And we also provide subsidized services. Almost 99% of the country is electrified. And even the bottom of our society can afford electricity, for example. But if you are to market price energy, that would throw many people out of electricity. If we privatize healthcare, I'm not sure how we would have even survived this pandemic. So even our strengths might get weakened with a sort of a post-IMF crisis that can emerge. But I think there will also be a lot of opposition to that, because our people have consistently defended these entitlements, whether it's free healthcare, free education, many of these services. So there's a lot that's going to change politically, but it isn't clear who is going to come to leadership in Sri Lanka to be able to chart that kind of a different path. And if you look at what happened in Greece, I think there were 3-4 governments that changed in the course of 4-5 years. So this is going to be that kind of a long drawn-out crisis with quite a bit of political turmoil. And through that, whether we will be able to come up with a feasible and viable plan of economic reconstruction and development is to be seen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kadirgamar. I think you've given a complete overall view, and we really wish that Sri Lanka gets out of this crisis ASAP, and wish you all a speedy recovery, if that suits you.
Thank you.